Okay, dear George, dear colleagues and dear friends, it's really my pleasure to introduce to you the keynote speaker of this morning, Professor George Downing. George Downing is a member of the teaching faculty at Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. He also teaches clinical seminars at the universities of Munich, Heidelberg and Basel. And he has been a member of the International Institute for Bioenergetic Analysis for over 30 years. George Downing is going to share with us his opinion about Al Lowen's contribution to body psychotherapy and humanistic psychology. Why did the Memorial Committee decide as first option to ask George Downing to talk to us about Al's contribution and Al's importance to body psychotherapy? Yes, it's known that George was a brilliant analyst, an excellent researcher in emotion, body and parent-infant interactions, a highly gifted teacher, as I did experience in person, and an inspired speaker. But all these attributes weren't the turning point for the decision to invite George to talk to us at Al Lowen's memorial. We invited George because he is an independent and honest thinker, a man who says what he believes, never mind whether his thoughts flew with the mainstream or deviate from this. As an example, in George's book, The Body and the Word, published in 1994, George defended Al against two, at that time, very common accusations. First, that Al Lowen's way of working with the body were too violent and too much cathartic. And secondly, that Al Lowen would neglect the pre-Oedipal phases and he were focused too much on Oedipal explanations by helping the patients to understand their past. It was just courageous and I think just brilliant how George at that time dealt with this kind of criticism. I'm now curious to get to know how you, George, today, when Al Lowen's contribution and life is completed, how you see Al Lowen's contribution for body psychotherapy. And I know for certain that all my colleagues here in this church share my curiosity. May I ask you, George, now to share your thoughts with us, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Hugo. It's a great honor to be here on this very special weekend. And thank you, Ed, Bill, Vivian, Hugo, for the invitation. The main thing I'd like to share with you this morning is a sense of paradox about Al's influence on the wider world of body psychotherapy and then indirectly humanistic psychotherapy in general. But before I get to that, I do want to just share one single memory about Al himself, because that seems like that's part of this weekend also. My own connection with the Institute was different from the other speakers. I joined in later. I did my training once the Institute had been formed as an institute. So Al's part in that training was as an outside trainer, in a sense. And I got to know him some later. After that, I'd written a few things he found interesting, and we had talks about that. And my relationship in that sense was very easy with him. It didn't have the complexities that many persons speaking this weekend had. It was simple. It was not a friendship. It was something more simple. It was not a close, complex colleague relation. It was something more simple. But I enjoyed it very much. I would contact him when I was in New York at times, and we would have a bite to eat or go for a walk or chat. And the talk was mainly about patients in the body and patients in the body and the patients. And I found him in that context open, not overly argumentative, curious, and full of a wonderful humor. And I just want to share one anecdote that says something to me about Al the person, and that was we were sitting in his where he worked. It was close to this area, actually, at that time. There was that walk-down studio in those years. And the phone rang, and it was Leslie. And there began a long, long conversation between Al and Leslie about Leslie's bowel movements. And this went into some detail, and there seemed to be a lot to discuss. She was just getting over some sickness of some kind. And I was uncertain. Should I go out of the room and let him have privacy or what? And then after a while I realized this was no matter for him. And it wasn't that he was trying to show that he was comfortable talking about all functions of the body and so on. It was really him. He was really living it. That his demystification, his extensive attempt to demystify our grasp of the body, our thinking about the body, our discourse about the body, etc., was real. It was really in him. And for him, talking about all that was as natural as talking about what groceries do we get tomorrow when we go shopping. All right, well, if we look at what is the influence Al had on the wider world of body psychotherapy, we see naturally an enormous influence. The two great influences are Al and Reich, and there are other people, of course, but especially those two. And if we try to pick apart what's more specific to Al, there are many things that Reich and Al had in common and that got emphasized in different ways from the two different directions. But if we look at what was specific to Al's influence, I think we can look at four different major areas. One is obvious, and that's the concept of grounding. Al's tremendous originality here, everybody recognizes and everybody appreciates. And it's common in just about all schools of body psychotherapy today to give at least some attention to the concept of grounding and to take it seriously. Another major contribution, of course, is the stress positions. They're widely used. Some schools use them a lot, some just a little, but there are few body psychotherapy schools that don't use them at all. They exist, but they're a minority. So the stress positions are out there being used week by week with patients in training and so on. And naturally, another major influence is the character types. This is a little more complex. Only some groups have taken over the character types and teach them and talk about them, usually pretty much the way Al over the years laid them out. Sometimes with some modifications, the modifications being usually rather small. The exception, of course, is Stanley Kellman, who made many more extensive changes, as is quite interesting, really, his own theory about character types, and I won't go further into that here. But otherwise, you have basically an overall picture of the character types, the way they're thought about in the Institute, with sometimes some minor changes and criticisms, and, oh, we should see it more this way and that way. So that in some schools, not others. And finally, something that's a little more diffuse, but I think is an enormous influence, is what we could call Al's theory of change. He never used those words, but you can see right away what I mean, that the therapy process should, let's say, not only give attention to the body, But change has to happen at the level of the body too. It's not just in the sense of people coming in contact with the body, but that there should be actual modifications in how the person organizes and uses his body, more free from the most important blocks, et cetera, better patterns of charge, discharge, and so on. And in a more diffuse sense, I think this has had an enormous influence. So that's one side of the picture. But as I say, I think if you look more closely, we see an interesting paradox. And first, the grounds for the paradox, at least in part, are that, as you know, Al had different ways to communicate, and that was one of his great strengths. It was lovely to listen to Leslie Case lay out more explicitly for us yesterday what Al faced in the early years, when the whole idea of body psychotherapy was mysterious, taboo, frowned upon, and so on. He was battling against something quite difficult, and he battled well. And that required a simplified way to communicate. People who haven't experienced work with the body don't get it in a certain sense at a deeper level. It requires a more condensed way to talk about the whole approach and the theory behind it. And as you know, he did that a lot. A lot of his communications outside the Institute were in this more simplified mode. And that's probably good, that he had a power in the way he did that and a directness. And even if not everybody agreed with him, many people began to develop a picture of what was going on with bioenergetic work. So that was very effective. At the same time, I think we have to recognize today that there's a consequence. And that's that we could think about that there exists a simplified model of bioenergetic work and a complex model. Here we share the complex model. And that's natural to us. We don't even think about it in those terms. We just think about, the model itself and then our various agreements and disagreements with fine points within it. But what's circulating outside is not really that, mostly. It's what I'm going to call the simplified model. And we see this paradox with each one of these areas I've just talked about. So take the concept of grounding. There's work with grounding outside the Institute being done. It's taken seriously, it's recognized, but it has little to do, in a sense, with the complexity of the work as it's done and taught inside the Institute. Think, for Al, I think we could safely say grounding is a lifelong journey. It's not something you get out of a few sessions. The sessions get you going. They steer you in the right direction. But that's just giving you a good, strong push to do the journey. And this is not appreciated in the concept of grounding outside the Institute, I think. This is lost. And this is a deep thing to have missing. So there's attention to grounding, but without this sense of the lifelong journey of grounding, and without this sense that it's something you come back to and work more deeply with in yourself after therapy and work more in yourself and so on. With stress positions also, the use of stress positions, there's a similar reduction in the way they're being used. They're being used, and sometimes well, for helping people get in touch with feelings, for having a quick access to emotion, to material that comes up from the past, and so on. What's much less transmitted is the role of the stress positions in the lifelong journey of grounding. Here again, the part that's lost is the idea you do the stress positions, and you do them again, you do them again, and there's something endless to get from them. There's an endless help and support for where you want to go, to get closer and closer to this more rich way to be in the world in a vertical sense. And this is very little appreciated, I think, outside the Institute. And I think that's one reason that outside the Institute, there's very little appreciation and understanding for the exercise classes. I think they're seen as a curiosity, or not a curiosity that gives a negative tone, but as a kind of little thing on the side, not so important. And they're almost never, the concept is almost never taken over by other schools. And why? Because the underlying conviction is, well, you work with grounding, you work with the stress positions in some sessions, and that does it, if you've done it well. Why this getting together and doing this stuff that looks more like a calisthenics class from the outside? Why bother with that? All a little bit odd. Well, each school has its funny little quirks. You can understand people thinking that way, but behind that thinking is a lack of appreciation of the role of continuing work with the legs, with the stress positions, with breathing, with emotions coming up, coordinating that inside oneself, re-coordinating it, rediscovering it. There's very little sense of that in this wider universe of body psychotherapy. And then if we look at the character types, to the extent they have been incorporated in other groups and schools, we see the same paradox, that what's been taken over is something rather oversimplified and is used well enough in its way, but it doesn't have the underlying richness that the approach to character types has in the Institute itself. And I think to get a handle on this, we have to acknowledge that the whole concept and theory of character types is really extremely complex. And I'm going to take a moment and just say a word or two about that. This is not the place this morning, as I see it, for a lot of theoretical back and forth and so on. But I just want to give you an idea about this to underline this point about this paradox of the transmission of the influence of L. And that's that if you think about it, the theory of character types is really several theories put together. And one is a set of ideas about current, present-day body structure, what you see when you look at the body, and current, present-day character and personality. And this is what's been taken over, especially. Look at the body, see what seems to correspond to the classic L version of body reading, to the extent the person understands that. See if that seems to map on to some of the problems the person's having, et cetera, et cetera. That's thought about and used with varying degrees of effectiveness quite widely among the groups that have incorporated the character types. But Al's grasp of it was much wider. And all our grasp of it is much wider. It's not just body structure, it's that, and that's important. But it's movement, it's its styles of different forms of movement. One can get right down to specific body parts. Think how much Al liked to talk about different kinds of reaching. The oral reaches, tendencies more to reach this way. The max is da-da-da-da-da-da-da. These are uses of the body. They're ways to organize the body in interactional contexts. They're ways to organize what one does with one's body in interaction with another person. They're in the moment, how I do it with my body. When I'm doing the body-body back and forth architecture of a human interaction. And Al was very zeroed in on this and spoke constantly about it. And so this is a big part too. I liked it so much. When Vivian Goose said that she liked the early book the best, I love it too, and that she liked the old title, not the language of the body, but the physical dynamics of character structure. Physical dynamics. Dynamics? That's not structure. Dynamics? What's dynamics about? Al never says a word about dynamics until almost the end of the book, and it's a long book. And there he says it, and it's about movement. It's about expressive ways to organize the body in interactional settings. That's dynamics. So this part is mostly being left out in the wider incorporation of Al's ideas. And then the concept of character types has another huge piece built into it, and that's the theory of development, the relationship to early development, what happened in development. And here, there's not much attention to that in the wider body therapy universe incorporation of Al's thinking. And look for a moment at how complex that is. Now, it's with justice that a number of people inside the Institute have pointed out that over the years, Al continued to be very, very fascinated and taken by triangle dynamics in the family, and to give a lot of weight to that. And I think it's absolutely right and very rich and valuable in the Institute that people like Bob Lewis and Bob Hilton and others have been trying to articulate more the early side, the 0 to 2 years side, the infant side of early interaction. But we have to point out as well that Al had that. Al talked about that. Al thought about that. It's true. Over the years, he gravitated more to the triangle dynamics. But the other was there. And you look back in the language of the body, the physical dynamics of character structure, you look back and you find extraordinary things about that. You know, there were two Al's in terms of communicating and writing and thinking. I think everybody here knows right away what I mean. There was Al, the communicator, who could condense and simplify and in a pithy way go, bam, this is the way it is. And then it was all put together in a short form, forcefully expressed, no ambiguities, etc. But there was another Al. There was Al, the probing thinker. Al, the trying to figure it out and knowing he's not completely sure of himself, but trying and probing in this direction and probing in that direction. You see a lot of that in that first book. And you see a lot of it in the discussions of early childhood interaction and early dynamics. And look at what he was doing and look at what he did. In his day, almost nobody was talking about that. Not in specific ways. Winnicott was writing beautiful things about mothers and babies and so on. Almost none of it is specific. Almost none of it is the mother does this and the baby reacts like that and then the mother does this in turn. You don't find that there. Mahler, here in New York, was just starting her observations of preschool children, and the later writings that were much more specific about early interaction weren't out yet at the time that Al wrote The Language of the Body. Mahler and others at that time emphasizing early interaction were frowned upon in the analytic world. So look at Al's dilemma back then. He was trying to work with ideas taken over from Freud and Abraham, some of it filtered through Otto Fenichel and some of it just direct from those two. And he was trying to widen the Reichian framework he had learned and to use this analytic thinking about development to do that. And so on the surface, it looks like, oh, he's taking the old Freudian Abraham idea, which was very prevalent at that time. Today, you hardly ever see it mentioned, but at that time it was a big deal, and that was the baby goes through an oral stage and then an anal stage and then comes to the edible stage, et cetera, et cetera. And he tried to take the idea of body zones. There was more talk then about body zones. But if you look carefully at what he says, and he should have said it, and he did, that most of that old talk about body zones was completely confused. It was full of the infant comes alive in this zone, but then has to relinquish it and move on to the next zone, but maybe he gets fixated there, da-da-da-da-da. A lot of that, rightly, has disappeared from analytic theory today. But Al gave a critique of it that was very trenchant, and a critique that saved the idea that the early interaction is extremely important and that the role of the body, the dimension of the body, is a critical part of it. And he saved it by changing almost every single point that had been made in those old theories about the progressive development of the body. And what you find in other texts, but especially in the language of the body, are vignettes of ideas about parent-infant interaction, parent-small-child interaction, which are highly specific, highly worked out interactional scenarios. This goes on and that goes on, and then the mother misses the baby's signals, and it was all mothers, of course, but at that time all the writing was just mothers, so that wasn't just Al. Then the mother misses the overt signals of the infant, instead focuses on this and that, and the results are this and this, and then the child acts like this and the mother responds like that. It's not worked out in a final, complete form, but I want to repeat. Al was doing then something nobody was doing. You don't find it anywhere else. And that's an extraordinary piece of creativity, an extraordinary piece of willingness to go out on a limb and stand for something that's not widely accepted. So that has been pretty much left out in a lot of the incorporation of character types. And as far as the theory of change goes, I think right now that you can see what I mean if I say that there's a sense in which Al's theory of change included something much more than just get in touch with the body, bring the body alive, be able to vibrate more, et cetera, et cetera. That's all there and should be, and it's wonderful. But that's simplified model. Complex model, Al, much more than Reich, believed in helping the patient build up specific new strategies with the body, specific new competencies, specific new skills with the body. It wasn't just open the blocks, let the energy flow, spontaneity, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the main slogans still today in the Reichian world. Al had that and had it as he should, but he also had the way to reach needs to be different, and the way to reach needs to be more coordinated with what the pelvis is doing. And under that, the legs and feet need to be supporting it in a different way, and on and on and on. Think about what Al talked about in terms of body parts. The two body parts, by far, he most talks about, the feet, no surprise, and the eyes. Pelvis, sure, the heart, sure, and wonderful things. But think about all the rich passages about the eyes. Very, very diverse. The eyes need to learn this. This patient had a look like that, and that devil metaphor came right to my mind, but then his face in the therapy changed. He was able to connect through his eyes in another way, et cetera, et cetera. So Al was looking for a sense of change in which ways to use the body became newly developed, newly organized, practiced, done in the world, brought further, developed further, and so on. That's a quite complex theory of change, and a very good one, I suggest. And this also has been lost in the transmission of the simple model. Well, that's a picture, and I think it has some implications. And I'm going to just give my suggestion of an overview of implications. One could talk a long time about all this, but just to give a very quick comment about this, and then I will end here because we have a lot of other interesting people to hear from this morning. I'd suggest that if this take on the situation is right, then there are some very interesting tasks, projects, and opportunities for the next years. And I see 4 of them myself, and one is a little bit separate from Al's basic way to view things, and that is to continue to refine and develop the relational perspective. This is a very rich part now of the bioenergetic world, and of course this has been done by others. And I thought it was wonderful how several people yesterday emphasized that Al put up with this, tolerated it, made room for it, even though it wasn't his natural way to think about things. And the ways to work with the relation, ways to think about the relation, we're still at the beginning of that. The analysts who emphasize that, for example, in the relational psychoanalytic organization here in New York, they're right at the beginning of this. The Boston Process Change Group, they're right at the beginning, and we're at the beginning. There's a huge amount more to do about this. And from inside the Institute, there's now the enormous advantages that there's been excellent writing on this subject already, and the body is there, the body is right in it, the body is central in the whole perspective on relation and therapeutic relation. And in the analytic world, that's just becoming to be recognized. It's starting to get thematized and articulated some now, but only in a very beginning way. So that's a job. Keep that going, endlessly going, all those difficult, different aspects of trying to get at what's really going on the relation level when we do therapy, and what are the different ways we can talk about that in the therapy. So it's a little bit separate from Al's legacy, but the other points have very much to do with Al's direct legacy. And the second point is, it could be interesting to think about the following: how could the complex model be better communicated to the wider therapy world? How could not just the simplified, more pithy, short, condensed pictures of what bioenergetic work is allowed to be transmitted, but something more about the deeper complexities of the model, which at times are a little bit messy and contradictory and not so neat and clean as the simple model. But these complexities are very rich, and it would be an important service, both to the Institute, but also more to people outside the Institute, if more of that could be communicated. And then a third task, as I see it, is preservation. And I was glad to hear this emphasized yesterday too. Preservation of the core teachings. And I think it's important one make a distinction between one's own personal way to work, one's own tendencies, and what are the teachings themselves as they exist. I thought Ed brought this out very nicely yesterday, talking about so-called hard bioenergetics and soft bioenergetics. Well, both are important, and hard is a very valuable part of the legacy. You maybe don't like to use it, or like many people, maybe use it in a more limited way, but it's part of the spectrum, and nobody else is teaching it and carrying it on out there. So that would seem preservation of this and many other core teachings, core ideas, and practices, practical clinical practices, seems to me an essential task, and the next few years seem to be a very good time to be thinking about that and trying to articulate that. And everybody's clear that doesn't eliminate the room for new creativity. And then the fourth interesting direction to head would be to go back to some of the old texts and dig out some of the very rich things there that have not been fully developed. They haven't been so explicitly spelled out, even in the complex model. Bob Lewis underlined this very nicely when he read to us the Paul Ricoeur quote about things that are embedded in a set of teachings, but they're still implicit. And for example, what I was underlining about early infant, parent-infant interaction is one whole set of riches, embedded riches in the old text, just waiting for further unfolding and explication. And I think Heiner Steckel was getting at a similar point about the things in Al's texts and teachings which are only partly explicit and only partly spelled out and could be much more rediscovered, unfolded, thought about, etc. So here could be four very valuable directions. I'm sure there could be more, but here are four. To continue refining the relational perspective, to try to communicate to the wider world more the complex model, in addition to the simplified model, to actively, in a thematized way, to think about and try to look at what needs to be preserved in the core teachings and practices, and lastly, to go back to some of these unopened envelopes, so to speak, that are lying back there in the old texts and try to work on making them explicit. Someone dies. A lot of you have been through this experience. The people close to that person at some point need to go to the home, and there's the furniture, and there are all the old records and, personal records, and so on and so on and so on endlessly. It's a very interesting emotional process. I'm sure many of you have been through it with a parent or with a sibling and so on. And, someone dies and you mourn and you work out inside, well, what did that person mean to me and what's in me from the person and what of that do I want to keep and what not? And very important, of course, is what can I still unfold in myself from that person that hasn't been unfolded yet? And that's the personal side, and that's the deep side, and the emotional side. But there's something else too, which is, a person dies and some people go back to the home, and there are all these things, all these objects, and it's quite fascinating and striking. What do we keep? Who takes what? What do we leave out? What do we preserve? Here are old photographs, here's furniture, here's 100 things. What do we do with this? It's a fascinating, interesting dilemma. And a lot of this weekend, I think, is about that dilemma. It's about the saying goodbye as well. But it's also about this fascinating dilemma. And I think it's a perspective on things that's going to occupy a good many people for quite some time now. So that's what I have to say. And then on the other level, it's also saying goodbye, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.